All right, here we go with another Monday QA. Thanks again for the questions. Let's dive right into this one. There's a few interesting questions here that I think a lot of people are going to get quite a bit out of because they're pretty relevant to right now. The first one comes in from Mason, and essentially it says, you guys wrote an article about the Conspirituality podcast that looks at the combination of conspiracy theory and spirituality. They seem to claim this phenomenon is dangerous and almost like there is a psychological issue driving people to think there is some form of global awakening happening. You guys talk about this. I'm assuming they mean the global awakening. Can you touch on how you'd respond to their critique of this? So just to bring everybody up to speed, just in case you haven't read it, there was an essay released recently on the site by Dr. Madhavassetti on our website, Collective Evolution. It's called The Conspirituality Podcast, Clear Signal or More Noise. And based on that article, the idea was that, you have this new podcast that I think a lot of people are pretty aware of. And it's called The Conspirituality Podcast. And it's kind of this idea of people, the three hosts were noticing that a lot of people out in the kind of the new age community or the yogi community or the wellness community were starting to become more interested in what they call conspiracy theories. And they were seeing this as like a phenomenon. And so if a lot of people were wondering, ooh, that's an interesting word, conspirituality, I kind of looked up where it emerged initially, and we're going to talk about that. But essentially, if you wanted to read that essay, there's going to be a link in the description below because it talks about this a little bit. And I did want to say that right off the top, before we kind of dive into this a little bit more, that the Conspirituality Podcast kind of really stems a lot around the phenomenon of QAnon and the phenomenon of the pro-Trump interest from a lot of the wellness community. And so most of it rides on that, but there are a lot of interesting things that they've thrown into the mix that we're going to discuss here. But that's just kind of a little taste. If you haven't heard of the podcast, it's basically three hosts that are kind of just looking at the wellness community's interest in conspiracy theories and kind of seeing this as a problem. So I kind of did a little bit of research, like, I wonder where this concept came from. And I found a paper that was published back in 2011 called The Emergence of Conspirituality. And the abstract here is pretty interesting. If you read through it, it sort of talks about how there's a female-dominated wellness community and a male-dominated conspiracy community, and there's this convergence that has been happening since way back in 2011. I'm sure it happened prior to 2011, and they started to notice that and then wrote a paper about it. I think the word conspirituality was sort of credited to, at least in this, a Canadian hip-hop group that initially first said the word, but then it started to become bigger as people wrote papers about this whole phenomenon. But there's two key aspects that they sort of look at when they're looking at writing this paper when it comes to defining what the conspirituality movement is. And it's the idea that there's a secret group that covertly controls or is trying to control the political or social order, and that humanity is undergoing a paradigm shift in consciousness. So these two pieces merged together is what this is about. And they're kind of saying, last piece I'll read with this is clients, i.e. people that belong to this conspirituality movement, they may reject the label of conspirituality, seeing their political beliefs as factual rather than paranoid. And they might dislike New Age associations, but this movement is large enough to warrant a name, which is why they gave it conspirituality. So what I'm trying to get at here and why I went this route is the guys that are running the Conspirituality Podcast, I'm assuming this is exactly where they went to kind of get their idea and their thesis for how they were going to go about creating this podcast. And so there, with that said, the question that initially came in here from Mason was related to this idea that there is this global shift in consciousness, right? We obviously have talked about that. It's we've been talking about it since way back in 2009, and it's kind of obviously a big piece to what we're doing. And of course, the conspirituality movement would essentially throw what we're doing based on this definition into that. So this idea that we're examining various what we call conspiracies that are going on in the world. And we also have this perspective of, hey, there's some form of shift in consciousness taking place, which I think is always going on. It just feels like it's intensifying right now, given how fast things are unfolding, given the new information age and so on and so forth. So the question was essentially looking for clarity on this whole thing. So here's what I'll say when we're looking at this conspirituality discussion. Whether you look at I didn't want to pay the $48 to read this whole article because you actually have to buy it. And I've listened quite a bit to the Conspirituality folks here and there because I do think they're having some very meaningful conversations within their podcast. I think that they're touching upon some interesting phenomenon that are taking place. Like if you read my Conspirituality essay, which I know kind of sounds similar to the Conspirituality one we just did, but the Conspirituality essay that I wrote acknowledges that we've even witnessed for, since way back in 2009, that there is an issue where some people that are very sort of into this idea of conspiracy theories can often throw the baby out with the bathwater and just believe that everything is a conspiracy theory, right? And there's an issue that exists there. What I believe is the polarization of that is the people who are critical of conspirituality, which is to say, if you look at the position that the conspirituality folks are taking, likewise with this whole idea, there's often a lack of context. So there's this belief that conspiracy doesn't exist. There's this belief that anybody who believes in conspiracy theories they're all the same. So there's no difference between understanding, like say, looking at 9/11 and seeing the conspiracy that exists there versus flat Earth. It's the same level of crazy. There's no possibility that these architects and engineers are right about 9/11, just as there's no possibility that the hundreds of people or thousands of people online that believe the Earth is flat. It could be even more than that. I don't know. But they're the same level of crazy. That's the position that the conspirituality folks are taking. And the challenge with that is, again, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So the idea that consciousness is evolving at this time, we made a whole documentary about this, looking at the cultural, the scientific, the ancient history, right? If you pull all of it together, and you look at it and you say, oh, are we going through a time where, our institutions are breaking down, where people's thought is changing a lot more than, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Absolutely, right? We're having a quickening effect of people coming to questioning about what's happening. And we're seeing right in front of us a loss of faith in our institutions. And you can put a definition on whatever you think this is, whether you want to say it's a great awakening, whether you want to say it's a massive shift in consciousness. It doesn't matter. To me, it's irrelevant that we talk about a label for it. And it's more important that we recognize that there is a really large loss in trust in institutions taking place right now that has been increasing deeply. Our institutions that make up our society is a reflection of the way we currently think, which is a reflection of our current level of consciousness or our current level of self-awareness about who we are, why we're here, what we're doing, right? Why should we have trust in government? Why should we have trust in media? Why should we have, health policies, all this sort of stuff? All this stuff is crumbling because people are seeing and they're gaining more information and they're seeing an expansion of information that is painting a different worldview. It's not one worldview. It's painting many different narratives about what's going on in our world. And so people are having this okay, it's time to kind of re-question the beliefs I had about society as a whole. So do I feel and do I observe that there's something going on that is somewhat of a massive sort of shift in consciousness? Absolutely. I think that's going on. But I don't think it has to be as mystical as, I'll say it this way, I don't want the mystical nature of what might be going on. I don't want that to take away from the very reality that this is going on, and that if we look at it as just a mystical thing that's happening, it's going to take away from the legitimacy of the fact that this is an opportunity not being presented because there's a whole bunch of people online spreading conspiracy theories, but it's an opportunity being presented because there's truth to it, right? There is actually corruption out there. There is actually conspiracy out there. There is a desire within human beings right now. You probably watching this might even be feeling this, that we're capable of more. We're capable of something so different here in society and on earth, and we can feel that. And part of that feeling gets us to go and look at, okay, there are these holes, there are these problems going on within our society. And it doesn't just mean we have a psychological problem because we don't trust institutions, right? It could mean that, we are seeing issues and it's time to address them, and it's time to make that world a reality that we do know is possible within ourselves. So, this sort of addresses some of the worldview idea that there is a shift going on. Now, I did write the Conspirituality essay, which was to look at the idea that it's time for a serious conversation within the conspiracy space, because I do feel, and I have felt this for a very long time, that there's an issue, you could say, which I believe is mainly just a communication issue and a confirmation bias issue, where a lot of what's happening is very much what is the target of the Conspirituality podcast. Right? So the Conspirituality podcast and much of the mainstream is they're targeting the most extreme conspiracy theories, and they're using that to wipe out every single conspiracy theory that exists, right? So what we're seeing happening is, and this is why I kind of alluded to the idea over the past several years, that I don't know that it's a good idea necessarily to focus everything on QAnon. People ask me, like, what do you think of it? What do you think of that? What do you think of this? Like, well, to me, and I've said this in a lot of the videos I've put out over the past little while, I think the whole Q phenomenon, it touches, there's pieces of truth within the, like when you analyze the Q drops, you're going to find pieces of truth because you're analyzing it and you can make it seem however you want it to seem. Now, are there Q proofs? Sure. There's little things here and there that might say, hey, there might be some connection between the people that are writing this and maybe somebody inside, the Trump administration, maybe, perhaps. But I stay away from QAnon. There's a reason why I do, because you don't need it to explore any conspiracies, and most of the analysis of QAnon, I think, is way off, right? Like, I think it's very extreme, it's very polarized. It's looking at Trump and the administration as like a savior, right? And it's looking at a lot of different conspiracies or a lot of different things that's setting up a target that's really easy to debunk, right? If you were to say, okay, well, let's talk about conspiracy theories in a serious way, which again is the premise of the Conspirituality essay that I wrote. If you want to look at certain conspiracies that take place and say, how am I going to communicate this idea effectively to people? I've always said Q is not the way to go, right? It's too easy to debunk. It's too obscure. It says almost nothing and you have to go find what it means. That's the definition of, conspiracy theories that are crazy. If you actually look at the mainstream, the way they define people who believe in conspiracy theories, seeing patterns where they don't exist, right? Finding patterns that other people would probably not find. That's the essence of what the Q phenomenon is it's people trying to find patterns all over the place and build a story. So why would you take the mainstream definition of unhinged conspiracy theories and make that the forefront of exploring conspiracy and corruption? Why would you do that? Well, it sounds more like a trap, a psychological trap that you would put out into society to set up a target that says, now we can point to that Q phenomenon as being just every conspiracy theory is unhinged. Look how big it got. Look how crazy these people are, right? And this doesn't take away from the fact, like, I'm not sitting here saying that there's nothing true about the Q phenomenon. What I'm saying is I would never use that as an example to explore the conspiracy discussion. Right? I think we need to have a serious conversation about this, which is to say, how can we look at the facts and evidence and ask ourselves the question as people, if we were to bring questions and ideas and conversations to people to help expand their thinking, to maybe look at the world and maybe test our worldviews a little bit, what would be the best way to do that? What would be the best way to look at evidence, examples, current events, so on and so forth, to expand people's thinking about what's going on? And if you ask yourself that question, QAnon is off the table right away. Because I've been into this for like 11 and a half years. I've been researching conspiracy related stuff or spirituality related stuff or just following my own intuitions on stuff for 20 years. And I look at the Q phenomenon and I'm like, this isn't, I wouldn't go there. It's not that it's like the poo in the punch bowl. It's like, there may be some truth to it, but it's just not the way I'd go. And if you look at the effect it's having in society, it's like every conspiracy theory is literally being wiped out now as an alt-right conspiracy because of the prevalence of that, right? And I kind of I'm just looking at some notes here because I wanted to make sure I did a good job sort of expressing this, because I think it's a nuanced conversation that people are really going to be empowered in how to have conversations about a lot of this stuff. The more we sort of get really grounded about it, and really realize that the folks at the Conspirituality podcast are throwing the baby out with the bathwater with the work that they're doing. Because like take vaccines, for example, right? I listened to a podcast they did on vaccines, and I was sitting in the car with my wife, and it was kind of like, oh, okay, we're listening to it, and I'm like, they're setting this up like, I bet you they're going to say this, and this. And sure enough, over the 15, 20 minutes that we started listening to it, they said this, and this. Exactly the script, the debunking vaccine script that you might find, which when you look at it, it matches, if you were to Google vaccines and you were to find the fact checkers and what the fact checkers say, and you read through it, right? And they're actually fact checking our articles half the time. If you read through it, you would find that they literally just took that script and put it into their podcast. Here's the challenge. The position they took as the Conspirituality podcast going into the vaccine discussion was, we already believe that anti-vaxxers are bad. We already believe that their idea of vaccines is false. So what they did was they went in with that research and looked at research that confirmed that. They didn't go, okay, what is actually true about vaccines? What is actually going on? And then looked at all the information available and came up with, whether it be a position or at least here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and put that forward. They didn't do that. They said, we already know it's bad because everybody who believes in that is just an unhinged conspiracy theorist. And then they found everything to confirm that. And this is the issue that's happening within society on both sides of the conversation. On the conspirituality side, which there are no conspiracies, but on the conspiracy theory side, where people who are like too obsessed with the worldview of that, they go in saying everything is a conspiracy. The government would never, ever do anything to help anybody, and that every large corporation, every celebrity, every CEO that's big or everything is always nefarious, 100% of the time. Therefore, every event that happens, they're looking to find out how it links to their conspiracy worldview versus saying, okay, let's take a step back and say, what is actually going on and what story might it tell? Which you're going to find a way more balanced perspective. You're still going to see a ton of corruption. You're going to see the existence of conspiracy. You're going to see that sometimes people take it too far, right? And sometimes things aren't as nefarious as you might think, and that some of it is just part of human condition and part of the way we see things and our obsession with control and all these different things. So when I wrote the essay, Conspirituality, the idea was it's time for a serious conversation, which is to step back, right? Which is to say, let's look at this as a whole, right? And we've tried to sort of set that flag since we started 11 and a half years ago, saying, hey, here's a model for how we can look at this stuff without getting super duper into the conspiracy or super duper into the denial of it all. Let's look at what's actually going on, because a big part of that is going to force you to have to personally transform. Develop your self-awareness, develop your understanding of self, develop your intuition a little bit, look at your cognitive biases, look at all the different areas that you get stuck, your lenses of how you see certain things, right? It's going to help you take a step back and learn to feel a little bit more, learn to sense a little bit more, learn to empathize with people, right? The purpose of our work is to take spirituality and personal transformation and apply it to real life. So it's not to say, hey, let's just talk about chakras and all these different things and just kind of, hey, that's spirituality and then politics is over here. It's like, no. When you're in your spiritual practice and you gain a level of self-awareness, you gain a deeper understanding, a deeper connection to yourself, you step into who you truly are a little bit more. How does that state of being now interact with real life? How does it not only navigate the chaotic situation that we have going on in front of us, but how do we then project a new future and work to create that new future, right? That's spirituality in action. That's personal transformation in action. That's what we're trying to do here, right? So, again, going back to what, some of the critique about the Conspirituality podcast there and why we wrote the article was not to pick on them and say, hey, they're bad, they're wrong, they're doing, horrible work and la-da-da-da-da. It's not to say that they're dangerous and so is the, super conspiracy folk or whatever you want to say. It's not to say that either position is dangerous. Either position is what it is. It's very biased, right? And it's going to see what it wants to see to confirm its worldview. However, there's truth in both camps. And if we can take a step back and we can look at this stuff and we can say, let's have a serious conversation about this and let's personally transform along the way, we're going to get a lot further. So what I see here as just a final note is with this conspirituality phenomenon is there have been things that have happened, right? Like the Q phenomenon, for example, that have set up a target that has been incredibly easy for the mainstream to debunk and throw everything out. And so it begs this deep question of, what is our end goal? What is our end result when we're looking at understanding the world, right? If our end goal and end result is to understand what's happening, understand how our current state of being as a collective is creating our society, right? We're going to find that conspiracy exists, that corruption exists, that, these other pieces of the puzzle are there. How do we best and effectively convey that to the rest of humanity, right? To other people that might need to see that, if that's how we feel, right? How do we best do that? What's the most effective way of doing that? If the end result is, I want to create a better world. If the end result is just to be entertained by the craziest theory out there, that's okay. That might be what you're into right now. Then you know that your end result is that. And so you're going to see everything through that lens. But if you want to create change and you truly want to create a world where we can thrive, then you have to recognize that we're sharing this planet with a community of people that if you go with the most extreme thing that does have a lot of falsity within it too, then they're going to have a very difficult time connecting with that. So I think we're being urged to learn how to communicate and learn how to connect. That's my feeling on that. So I hope that answered that question in a deep manner. And I'm looking at my notes, and I think I covered it. Oh, just to touch on how this relates to a previous question we had last week, the future of journalism. Everything I just sort of described would be the future of journalism to me. So it's to say, you pull out all the biases, you pull out all the stuff, you take a step back, and you say, what is actually going on, right? So the conspirituality folks would have to say, take no position about vaccines. What is the truth? What maybe not the truth, but what is actually taking place across the board? And what does that say? And then let's tell people that, as opposed to, I already have a position and I'm just going to look for things to confirm that position. Because you can do that on either side of any equation, right? Okay, moving on to the next question here. This one comes in from Wes. What do you see as the most effective way to use the internet and web technology to facilitate our collective evolution? And then besides your platform with a little tonguey out face there, he means for the rest of us. So this is a good question. I think part of this is happening right now, right? Technology, the internet, all these sorts of things provide, almost like instant and most of the time meaningful, I shouldn't say most of the time, but I would say a fraction of the time, meaningful connection. There's most of the time I think that goes on, we have connection that may be a little bit fickle, or sometimes on the internet, and I won't get into this and this because we can go on all day about this stuff. Sometimes we have a tendency to really dehumanize the person on the other end or the people on the other end of any community. And I don't blame that on technology as much as I blame it on we're still evolving into this idea of how to utilize technology to maintain connection. And while I think, like, for example, you have the social dilemma, which sets forth this idea that technology as a whole is going to automatically create this idea that it's going to train our brains to dehumanize the other person. I think there's an easy way to step in there with self-awareness and with understanding and remembering, like, hey, there's a human on the other side there. Like, and you can, from a distance, feel that person. If you really want to, you can do that, right? The nature of our reality is connection. The nature of our reality is you can affect something non-locally. We know this through quantum physics. What's to say that you can't take a step back, set into yourself for a moment, be very self-aware, and really tune into and empathize with the words that someone typed out on a digital screen, right? There can be connection, but it requires a level of self-awareness. So in a sense, again, back to the first question, so much of what's happening within technology and communication is actually, once again, pushing us to say, yeah, we need more offline community and connection. We absolutely do. But there is some of that connection that can absolutely take place through the digital world. But it requires us to actually take a step back, take an extra breath, and really connect with what someone's saying without just reacting really quick through the computer screen. So how we can facilitate the collective evolution, to call it that, through the internet and technology is much like what has been happening over the last, however many years that a lot of people have had access to it and have been disseminating information. Again, going back to the quickening of a lot of this stuff, I think a lot of the use of technology and internet in creating the collective evolution is happening right now. I think how we could best use it, how we could most effectively use it, would be to really examine our relationship with our, I should say, really explore, how am I communicating with people, or how am I potentially judging, or how am I listening to communication that may not be in video form? So if I'm sitting here in video form, not only are you seeing my facial expressions, which is important because facial expressions convey to you certain parts of your nervous system. It conveys different ideas that affect your nervous system, that affects how you feel. Not only that, but the tone of my voice will have similar communicative effects on your nervous system and on yourself. And it helps us create a connection. But there are times where, hey, we're just writing, right? Because that also plays a role. And to effectively use these forms of communication while we're writing would be to take that extra step to really try and sense what is being written here, right? To really sense, where did I potentially put tone, right? Or put a perspective on what this text is saying that may not have actually been the intention of the writer. And sometimes you may not know, in which case we can take a step back and say, is there a way for me to ask? Is there a way for me to connect with this person and say, hey, what more do you mean there? Or, hey, is there a way we can communicate this a little bit more easily, right? Or more effectively? And so I think part of it is changing our relationship with it. I think there's enough information out there. I think there's the existence of technology, the existence of the internet, when talking about just information, there's enough out there that it really at this point comes down to us learning how to perhaps better navigate information, perhaps better connect with information, perhaps better empathize with where people are coming from, not dehumanize the people on the other end, but really make a little bit of an extra step to have a connection there. Now, just I'm going to say for a moment web technology, right? I'm going to pretend that technology as a whole is part of this discussion as well, just as a kicker to this, because I believe I answered the question. If more clarity is needed, by all means, throw it in the comments and I'll see what else I can add there. But technology as a whole too sometimes has it's almost like baby out with the bathwater again, right? So I was looking at this thing the other day where we have this ways of interacting with our brains, right? So technology that can interact with our brains, that can help people who currently can't see or currently can't hear, they might get those senses back, right? And this is fantastic technology, but it interacts with the mind, right? And of course it leads to this automatic jump. Hold on a second. Neural implants is 100% negative, because neural implants would mean that someone else could potentially have control over our mind. It's like, yeah, absolutely. That could happen. But what about for those people that are deaf, where it could allow them to hear again? And what about for those people who are blind, that it could allow them to see again? What about the person who has lost an arm, that could allow them to have a usable mechanical arm again, right? So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's use our awareness. Let's see when or where might this technology at times be pushing in the direction of, well, they're trying to take over everybody. Or when can we say, well, hold on, there's a lot of humans out there that have a ton of ingenuity and they actually really do care about people. And are we really going to say that in every case it's all just evil? Right? Because that doesn't really make sense. So what we start to look at there and what we start to examine when it comes to technology, and sometimes our fear of it, is, and this is a really nuanced discussion. And so don't take everything I'm saying as like, oh, you can just paint everything with the brush that I'm about to use here, because there is more nuance and there's more back and forth that we can have here. However, when we look at technology and we look at what's going on there, there are a lot of benefits, right? There are a lot of potential negatives. But what we start to realize is we do have a lack of trust in our governing institutions. And that lack of trust is painting a future for humanity that says, well, technology can only ever be evil. But what happens if that technology was used in a society that was built upon the worldviews that we've discussed over the past several videos? What happens if it was built upon the idea of helping humanity to thrive and helping to bring pure potential to people? Would those same neural implant technologies be used to control everybody's thoughts and brains? Is it innate within human beings to want to be evil and to want to use these technologies in this manner? Is that part of your worldview? Or is that what you've developed from looking at society as a whole today that says, hey, there's people that do bad things and there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of conspiracy out there, right? Which is partly true. So the question is there ever a future for humanity? Is there ever a state of being within humans where these technologies are used purely beneficially with no potential agenda for, a pure takeover of the human mind? Right? These are questions you have to ask yourself, because it kind of changes the way we might view technology in assisting with the thrivability of human beings. But again, nuanced discussion. And the final question here came in through email. So, and again, I'm not sure if they wanted this, so I won't reveal the name. But the question here, well, it's sort of a statement that is like a question. So exploring, they have a couple of ideas when looking at the current social landscape of what's going on. They were suggesting to explore the link between COVID and the Epstein Island scandal. There seems to be something suspicious about how COVID happened at just the right time to keep everyone's attention off the pedophilia scandal, which had just been exposed. So the way I'm sort of looking at this as a question is almost to say, like, is it possible that the COVID obsession, right, the mass media flow of this is covering up the story of the Epstein pedophilia stuff and where that could have went? Now, a lot of times it has happened where government or powerful interests will wait for a time like New Year's or Christmas Eve or something like that, and they'll pass a policy bill that's really super controversial and nobody really hears about it, nobody really knows about it. All the media coverage is kind of pointed to, here's the festivities going on or whatever it might be. And so that, amongst other things where, hey, everybody's focused on this bombing that took place here, and yet, you know, a whole bunch of stuff went on behind the scenes. These things do happen, right? Where stuff is passed during a distraction. Now, this may be part of the story, right? There's no way of really knowing. To explore this as a journalist would be extremely difficult to draw a conclusion. But to be able to say that it's possible, absolutely. Perhaps a bigger question would be, is it possible that, you know, what we're seeing with Epstein and the island and the pedophilia stuff and what's going on there is very interesting for a group of people to question things, right? They're ready for the exploration that, to some extent, the elite level of people, as we call it, right? Powerful interests, perhaps use people like Jeffrey Epstein to create blackmail type situations that entrap other powerful people so they can control each other, right? Because that's really kind of what's going on with the Epstein stuff. And that's going to awaken certain people to conspiracy, to corruption, to non-elected officials having very big influence over policy. A certain group of people going to be very interested in that. Another group of people is going to awaken deeply or question things deeply when they see things about COVID that don't add up. When they're seeing, like, hold on a second, they're locking down the whole planet for something that has a very low infection mortality rate. They're silencing certain doctors while platforming other doctors. And these doctors, like, their narrative changes from week to week. And the things that they lied about, or, said were not possible, at the beginning, halfway through they said, yeah, that is actually true. We were wrong, Meanwhile, these censored doctors were saying it from the beginning. Those inconsistencies start to wake up a whole different group, another group of people, right? Which is, again, if you've been around a long time here at CE, we've talked a lot about how people have different endpoints of questioning their reality, right? Questioning their own self. Stuff that might drive them to question their own lenses, stuff that might drive them to gain a better sense of self-awareness, connection to self, right? They might have different experiences that draws different things within them. Everybody has a different in, right? Some people, it's health, right? They look at health and they're like, wow, there's corruption within the health and pharmaceutical industry. And that wakes them up. And so they start to question other things, right? They start to look at life differently. So sometimes I see it as, it's possible, right, that they may be using the COVID as somewhat of a distraction. There could be, and I believe there are some other agendas involved as well. I also think there's a deep underlying opportunity to question so many aspects that we've discussed over the past, several videos, over the past year, really, which is to say COVID is challenging us to question what our thoughts were and what our allegiances were and what our feelings were on life. And what we were used to, and what we kind of just unconsciously did. Is that really how we want to live? Is that really a world where we're thriving? Do we really want to step back to that? Now that we've taken away so many of these things that are going on, and we're forced to take a step back and look at it, what do we really want to create? What do we really want it to look like? How do we really want it to feel? And yes, at the same time, there's what feels like an onset of more totalitarian, authoritarian control. Would we have all agreed to some extent that that was playing out? And I'm not saying we all agree at this point, but more of us are starting to see this. Would we have all agreed if there wasn't a mass event that gave us the opportunity to see it more clearly, right? So a lot of these things have an evolutionary role, right? And so it may not be a pure distraction, the COVID thing, away from the pedophilia stuff. It may just be that a whole other group of people is now going to wake up, perhaps, if you want to use that term, and then perhaps be even more inclined to look at some of the Epstein stuff and see the possibility within it versus the sheer denial of it, right? So I think it can play in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different ways to look at stuff. But again, I think it all leads back to what we talked about in the first thing, which is if we can effectively communicate these ideas and get people to question things, when you get people to question versus telling them what the truth is, it automatically allows them to put their defenses down and explore for themselves, come to their own conclusions about things, provide different pieces of information, but don't say, oh, this is a sheer and utter fact, right? Because then someone's going to look for all the reasons why not to believe that fact, right? They're going to poke holes in everything there because it may not be a fact in some cases, right? But if we get into this mode where we're curious again and we're connected and we want to ask questions, we want to explore things, we're going to have a much easier time looking at stuff. I built a course about 4 or 5 years ago called How to Talk to Friends and Family about Truth and Consciousness. I think that was at the time what it was called. Put it out through the Explorer Lounge, which eventually became CETV. And not a lot of people saw it, but it was a fantastic course. It's like 6 hours long. And so much of it talks about how we've, over the past course of time, utilized these ways of questioning things and exploring things to get past what I call the security system in people's mind, which is kind of their ego, that is always just trying to deny new information, why we hold on to our current worldviews. And this was a way of really connecting, empathizing with people, and kind of finding common ground in a lot of ways. We're kind of working on we are working on releasing that course, re-releasing, sprucing it up a little bit, bringing it up a little bit more to speed to some current times, but the same core underlying ideas would be there. But it's a very powerful thing, and I think that's kind of what helps us, again, navigate these situations where so many things are happening, and in some sense, they do tie together, but maybe not in the ways that we might think, but they do tie together into larger conversations. Yeah, I think that answered pretty much everything. Felt like I had something else I wanted to throw in there, but I just can't remember it. So we'll leave it at that for this week. Again, if you have any questions for next week or anything like that, definitely throw it down in the comments. Be happy to continue on with this. I think this is a useful process for expanding on a lot of the ideas that we put out and the different things that are going on out there, and kind of bringing a deeper or greater conversation to it where we can kind of go back and forth too as a community, which is always good. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for watching once again, and for submitting questions.